Madagascar sits off the eastern coast of Africa, separated from the mainland by the Mozambique Channel, surrounded on every side by African nations. By geography alone, it should be an African island with an African language and African ancestry running through its people. It isn't. The people of Madagascar speak a language with no roots in Africa at all. Their closest linguistic relatives aren't across the channel in Kenya, Tanzania, or Mozambique. They're 4,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean, in the Philippine Islands of Southeast Asia, Malagasy, spoken by over 20 million people. It isn't an African language, it's an Austronesian language, part of the exact same family as Tagalog, Cebuano, and Ilocano. And when linguists line up Malagasy vocabulary, grammar, and sound patterns against Philippine languages, the overlap isn't vague or coincidental, it's specific and systematic. The word for eye in Malagasy is maso in Visa and it's mata. The word for water is rano in Malagasy, close to ranor. In some Philippine dialects, the word for person, olona, in Malagasy, traces back to the same Proto-Austronesian root shared with Filipino languages. The number system, the sentence structure, the way verbs get conjugated, all of it points straight back to Southeast Asia, not Africa. And that raises a question that's kept linguists, geneticists, and historians busy for over 2 centuries. How did speakers of a Philippine-related language end up on an island off Africa? Who made that crossing? When? How did they survive it? And why does barely anyone outside academic circles know this story? It's because this is one of the great maritime achievements in human history, and it traces back to the same ancestral world as the Filipino people. Starts with the language evidence, because this connection isn't some recent or fringe idea. Western linguists have documented it since the 1700s. In 1708, a Dutch linguist named Adriaan Rieland compared Malagasy vocabulary against Malay and other Austronesian languages and concluded that Madagascar had been settled by people from Southeast Asia, not Africa, an idea that seemed almost unbelievable at the time, given the distance involved. Over the 20th century, comparative linguistics got a lot more precise, and researchers pinned down exactly which branch of the Austronesian family Malagasy belongs to. It turns out Malagasy is most closely tied to the languages of the Barito region in southeastern Borneo, and those Barito languages are themselves closely related to Philippine languages, sharing a common ancestor known as Proto-Malayo-Polynesian. Malagasy sits firmly within the same Southeast Asian branch. That includes the Philippines, Indonesia, and the Pacific. But the Philippine link runs deeper than just a shared family tree. Specific words in Malagasy line up with Philippine vocabulary in ways that can't really be explained by coincidence or borrowing, especially in the most stable layers of language, things like body parts, kinship terms, and farming vocabulary, the words that tend to survive largely unchanged for centuries. Even through its heavy outside contact, the word for rice in Malagasy is very, tracing to the same Proto-Austronesian root behind rice vocabulary in Tagalog-related languages. The word for house is trano, connected to shared architectural vocabulary across the Philippine Austronesian world. Even the grammatical habit of distinguishing older versus younger siblings, a feature especially characteristic of Philippine-type Austronesian languages, shows up in Malagasy in matching form. This isn't a surface-level similarity, it's the linguistic signature of people who came from the same ancestral world as Filipinos, who spoke languages branching off the same root tongue, and who carried those words across 4,000 miles of open ocean to plant them on a new island, where they're still spoken by 20 million people today. Now, the genetics, because language alone can spread through trade or influence without a single person actually moving, DNA is harder to fake. And the DNA of the Malagasy people tells essentially the same story as the language does. Genetic studies of Malagasy populations, especially the more thorough genomic work done in the 2000s, show a population that's roughly an even split, about half its Southeast Asian ancestry and about half East African, largely Bantu-related ancestry from the coast, and that Southeast Asian half isn't some generic regional signal, it's specific. Haplogroup analysis, which tracks genetic markers passed down the maternal and paternal lines, shows the Southeast Asian ancestors of the Malagasy people are most closely related to modern populations in Borneo and the Philippines. Specific maternal line markers found in Malagasy populations show up in Philippine populations at frequencies strong enough to suggest a direct ancestral link, rather than just distant relatedness. In plain terms, the mothers of the founding Southeast Asian population in Madagascar came from the same genetic world as the mothers of the Filipino people. Today, the paternal line data tells a similar story, with Y chromosome markers characteristic of the Philippine and Borneo maritime world showing up in Malagasy men, the genetic fingerprint of generations of seafarers. One especially notable study, published in 2012 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, analyzed the genomes of over 2,000 Malagasy individuals against comparison populations across Africa and Southeast Asia. The conclusion was clear. Madagascar's founding Southeast Asian population was startlingly small, around 30 individuals. It's likely mostly women, arriving somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago from a region spanning Borneo to the Philippines. 30 people. That's the entire founding Southeast Asian population, behind roughly half the ancestry of a nation of 25 million people today. Sit with that for a second. 30 people in boats, crossing 4,000 miles of open Indian Ocean, with nothing but an understanding of currents, wind patterns, and star navigation, becoming the ancestors of millions. As for timing, that's genuinely one of the more contested parts of this story, and it matters. It's for how we think about Philippine maritime history. Overall, the standard estimate puts Austronesian settlement of Madagascar somewhere between 1500 and 2000 years ago, roughly 500 BCE to 500 CE, based on how far Malagasy has linguistically drifted from its Southeast Asian relatives. It's combined with archaeological evidence of early settlement, but some researchers working from different linguistic models and newer archaeological finds argue initial contact could be considerably older. There's archaeological evidence of human presence in Madagascar dating back roughly 4,000 years. It's 2,000 years earlier than the standard settlement date, if even part of that earlier presence reflects Austronesian contact, even temporary or seasonal voyages, rather than full settlement. It would push the Philippine-Madagascar connection back to around 2000 BCE into the early Bronze Age, right around when Southeast Asian maritime cultures were already beginning the voyages that would eventually spread across the entire Pacific. The exact timeline is still debated. Who made the journey is not. It's settled that these were Austronesian, Southeast Asian, Philippine world, maritime people. Then there's the how, arguably the most mind-bending part of the whole story. Look at a map. Madagascar sits off East Africa, and the nearest Southeast Asian landmass around Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula is roughly 4,000 miles away across open ocean. There's no chain of islands connecting them, no stepping stones, no coastal shortcut. Reaching Madagascar from Southeast Asia meant either crossing the open Indian Ocean directly or tracing a long route around India and down the East African coast. For a long time, the assumption was that ancient sailors must have taken that longer coastal route, staying close to the shorelines of India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa, before finally reaching Madagascar, slower, but presumed safer. More recent analysis of ocean currents, seasonal wind systems, and the combined genetic and linguistic evidence has pushed many researchers toward a different, more direct explanation. The ancient Austronesian settlers likely sailed straight across the open Indian Ocean, using the monsoon wind system, riding seasonal winds that blow predictably from Southeast Asia toward East Africa every year between November and March.